The snow doesn't just fall in the black hills. It consumes. It erases the trails, silences the world, and buries secrets deep. For Elara Thompson, a widow living on the edge of nowhere in the winter of 1877, survival was a quiet, lonely battle. But one afternoon, a splash of impossible color against the endless white, the deep crimson of blood, would change everything. She found a man, a Lakota warrior, left for dead. In helping him, she would invite a world of danger to her door, proving that the most perilous frontier isn't the land, but the human heart. The wind had a voice in the Dakota Territory, and that winter of 77, it spoke of little but malice. It was a hungry, keening sound that scraped at the logs of Sylvia Thompson's cabin, searching for any chink, any weakness to pour its icy breath through. For 3 years since her husband Josiah had coughed his last into a bloody handkerchief, a victim of the miner's consumption, Sylvia had learned to live with that sound. It was the sound of her solitude. At 28, she was a woman carved from the very hardships that sought to break her. Her hands, calloused from the axe and tender from the needle, were never still. Her face, framed by auburn hair that stubbornly escaped its bun, was more handsome than beautiful, her features etched with a pragmatist's resolve. The softness of her youth had been weathered away, leaving behind the unyielding granite of a survivor. Her cabin was a small, defiant fist, clenched against the vast open palm of the wilderness. It stood in a shallow basin, backed by a ridge of ponderosa pines, tools from the nearest semblance of a town, a place called Custer City, that was more a muddy rumor than a settlement. Josiah had chosen the spot for its proximity to a promising creek, a creek that had yielded only fool's gold, and eventually his grave. Sylvia remained not out of love for the land. It was too cruel for that, but from a stubborn refusal to be chased off. This land had taken her husband. She would not let it take her home, too. On the 4th day of a relentless snowfall, the world had been reduced to 2 colors, the suffocating white of the ground and sky, and the dark green-black of the pines. The silence between gusts of wind was absolute, a heavy blanket that muffled even the sound of her own heartbeat. She needed more wood for the night. Pulling on Josiah's oversized sheepskin coat, which still smelled faintly of him, a scent of pine tar, sweat, and cheap tobacco, she took up her axe and stepped outside. The cold was a physical blow. It stole the air from her lungs and turned her breath to instant frost. She waded through snow that came past her knees, her eyes scanning the familiar rhythm of the trees near the woodline. And then she saw it. It was an affront to the monochrome landscape. A splash of crimson stark and obscene against the pure white. It wasn't the rust red of a fox or the dark brown of a deer. It was the vibrant arterial red of a man. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. Her first thought was an animal. A cougar perhaps had made a kill. But as she drew closer, her axe held tight in her mitted hand, the shape clarified. A body. Sprawled beside a fallen log was a man lying face down. The snow around him was a terrible canvas of his struggle. He was Lakota. There was no mistaking the long black hair, matted with snow and blood, or the beaded buckskin of his leggings partially visible where a heavy buffalo robe had been flung aside. A shattered bow lay a few feet away, and a single eagle feather, its vein torn, was half buried in a drift. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the layers of her clothing. The stories they told in Custer City were grim tales of savage raids and brutal vengeance, especially now, so soon after the dust had settled from the war over these very hills. The Great Sioux War, they called it. Custer's defeat at the Little Bighorn the year before had not been a victory for the Lakota, but a trigger for their final brutal suppression. To the settlers, every native man was a phantom of that battle, a specter of violence. He was dead. He must be. No one could survive this cold, especially with such injuries. She could turn back now, pretend she'd seen nothing. It was the smart thing to do, the safe thing. The wind howled its agreement, pushing her toward the cabin, toward warmth and ignorance. But something in her rebelled. Perhaps it was the ghost of Josiah, a good man who believed in helping a soul in need, regardless of the color of their skin. Or perhaps it was her own deep-seated stubbornness, a refusal to be ruled by fear. She took another cautious step forward, the snow crunching under her boots. "Hello." The word was a fool's gesture, snatched away by the wind. She reached the body and nudged his shoulder with the toe of her boot. There was no response. With a grunt of effort, she knelt and, bracing herself, rolled him over. The sight made her gasp. His face was a mask of dried blood and ice, his skin a pale ashen gray. A deep gash ran from his temple down his cheek, and his deerskin shirt was stiff with frozen blood from a wound she couldn't see. His eyes were closed, his lips blue. But as she watched, a faint, almost imperceptible cloud of vapor escaped those lips. He was alive. The knowledge hit her not with relief, but with a terrible, gut-wrenching weight. A dead man was a tragedy. A living man was a choice that could get her killed. If she left him, he would be dead by nightfall, his passing witnessed only by the uncaring sky. If she took him in, what then? His people, if they found him here, might see a captor, not a savior. The white men, if they found her harboring a Lakota warrior, would call her a traitor or worse. There was no winning choice. She looked down at his face. He was younger than her, perhaps only 20 winters old. Stripped of the blood and the grimace of pain, his features were strong, a proud straight nose, a firm jaw. He was not the monstrous caricature from the settlers' tales. He was just a man dying in the snow. "Damn you," she whispered, the curse aimed at him, at God, at her own conscience. "Damn you for not being dead." For a long moment she remained kneeling, the snow seeping into the knees of her trousers, the wind screaming around her. The cabin, with its warm hearth and locked door, seemed a world away. To drag him there would be a Herculean task. Her muscles ached at the mere thought of it. It was madness. It was suicide. She stood up, turned, and took 2 steps back toward her cabin. Safety, solitude, survival. Then she stopped. She looked back at the faint puff of his breath, a fragile flag of defiance against the overwhelming cold. She thought of Josiah, wasting away in their bed, how she had fought for every single breath he took, how she would have given anything for one more. With a cry of frustration that was part rage, part surrender, she turned back. The battle was just beginning. Getting him to the cabin was a nightmare of brute force and clumsy desperation. He was taller than her and solidly built, a dead weight that seemed to grow heavier with every foot she dragged him. She couldn't lift him. Instead, she hooked her arms under his, walking backward, pulling her boots, slipping her back, screaming in protest. The 40 yards from the wood line to her door became a frozen hell. Snow packed into her collar and melted down her back. Her lungs burned. Twice she fell, his weight pulling her down into the suffocating powder. Each time, gasping for air, she would look at his still face and the plume of his breath and get up again. Finally, she reached the porch. With one last agonizing effort, she hauled him up the 2 steps and through the doorway. Collapsing onto the rough-hewn floorboards beside him, her body trembling with exhaustion. The door swung shut, and the roar of the wind was suddenly diminished to a low moan. The silence inside was profound. There was only the sound of her own ragged breathing and the gentle crackle of the embers in the hearth. She lay there for a full minute, her cheek pressed against the cold wood, the smell of wet wool and blood filling her nostrils. She had done it. She had made her choice. The Lakota warrior was in her cabin. The blizzard raged outside, sealing them in a fortress of white. She had brought a dying man into her home. But as she looked at his still form, a chilling realization settled deep in her bones. She didn't know if she had just saved a life, or if she had just sealed her own doom. For a long while, Sylvia simply lay on the floor, the world a dizzying swirl of exhaustion and adrenaline. The warrior beside her was a silent, ominous presence, the reality of him more potent than the idea had been out in the snow. He was real. He was bleeding on her floor, and he was her responsibility. With a groan, she pushed herself up. Every muscle protested. First the fire. The embers were low, a faint orange pulse in the stone hearth. She fed them dry kindling, then a larger piece of split pine coaxing the flames back to life. A greedy, crackling roar filled the cabin, and with it a semblance of control returned. Warmth was life. She turned her attention back to the man. Light from the growing fire danced across his still form, casting long, flickering shadows. He needed to be moved, cleaned, and tended to. Getting him off the floor and onto her cot was the next impossible task. She tried to lift him by the shoulders, her boots slipping on the melted snow that pooled around them. It was useless. "All right, friend," she muttered to the unconscious man. "We're doing this the hard way." She grabbed the corners of the thick bearskin rug that lay before the hearth and with immense effort managed to roll him onto it. Then, gritting her teeth, she began to drag the rug across the floorboards, inch by painful inch, until he was beside her narrow cot. With a final desperate shove, she managed to get his torso and head onto the mattress, his legs still dangling onto the floor. It would have to do. Now for the wounds. She lit a tallow lamp, its steady golden glow, chasing away some of the more menacing shadows. She fetched her medical box, a small wooden chest containing little more than carbolic acid, clean linen, for bandages, a needle and gut thread, and a collection of dried herbs her mother had taught her to use. It was a pathetic arsenal against the kind of damage she suspected he'd sustained. She started with his face. Heating water in a kettle over the fire, she soaked a strip of linen and began to gently clean the gash on his temple. The cut was deep, crusted with blood and dirt, but it seemed the bone was intact. As she worked her fingers brushing against his skin, she was struck by the strangeness of the moment. His skin, though cold, was smooth beneath the grime. The lines of his face were proud. This was an intimacy she hadn't shared with another soul since Josiah. The thought was unwelcome, and she pushed it away, focusing on the task. The real problem was the wound in his torso. His deerskin shirt and a wool undertunic were frozen solid to his skin, a stiff carapace of blood and ice. There was no way to remove them gently. Taking a deep breath, she picked up her sharpest skinning knife. It felt profane to put a blade to him again, but she had no choice. Carefully, she began to cut the garments away from his body, the wet leather and wool parting with a sickening, tearing sound. When she finally peeled back the last layer from his side, her breath caught in her throat. Just below his ribs on the left side was a ragged, brutal puncture wound. It wasn't a clean slice from a knife or a neat hole from a bullet. It was torn, the flesh bruised a dark purple, and already showing the angry red of infection. It looked as if he'd been gored, perhaps by the horn of a surto, impaled on a sharp branch in a fall. Whatever the cause, it was lethally deep. Worse, as she cleaned the area, she found something lodged inside a small, sharp sliver of what looked like obsidian. It wasn't a Lakota arrowhead. Their flint was a different color, a smoky gray. This was black volcanic glass, sharp as a razor. It was the kind of arrowhead used by the Crow or the Pawnee tribes who often scouted for the army. The thought sent a fresh chill through her. This wasn't a hunting accident. This man was a warrior, and he had been in a fight. He had enemies. Working with trembling hands, she used a pair of pliers sterilized in the flames of the lamp to pull the shard free. It came out with a wet, sucking sound that turned her stomach. The man groaned a deep, guttural sound, and his body arched in pain even in his unconscious state. "Easy now," she whispered, her voice tight. "Easy. It's out." He didn't hear her. He was already sinking into the fever. The next 2 days were a blur, a living nightmare contained within the 4 walls of the cabin as the blizzard raged outside. The warrior whose name she did not know drifted on a turbulent sea of delirium. The fever took him, wrapping him in a shroud of heat that left his skin burning to the touch. He thrashed against her cot, his powerful limbs flailing, and she feared he would injure himself further. He spoke not in English, but in the fluid, rhythmic cadence of his own tongue. The words were meaningless to her, but their tone was not. She heard anguish, anger, and sometimes a soft, sorrowful pleading. He was reliving the fight, the cold, the pain. Sylvia became a ghost in her own home, moving silently from the fire to the cot, from the water bucket to the medicine box. Sleep was a luxury she could not afford, snatched in 10-minute increments in her rocking chair, the rifle always resting against the wall beside her. She kept a constant vigil, bathing his forehead with snow-melted water, forcing sips of willow bark tea, a bitter brew to fight the fever between his cracked lips. He would choke and struggle, his subconscious mind rejecting her help. But she persisted, tipping the cup, letting the liquid dribble into his mouth. In his delirium, he was not a threat, but a child, helpless and vulnerable. The fear she'd felt initially was replaced by a grim, weary determination. She was no longer thinking about the consequences about his tribe or the settlers. Her world had shrunk to this single, desperate task, keeping this man alive until the fever broke. She found herself talking to him, her voice low and soothing, the way she had talked to Josiah in his final days. "You have to fight," she'd murmur, wringing out a cloth. "Don't you dare give up. You fight this. You hear me?" On the second night, the fever reached its peak. His breathing became shallow, his pulse a frantic, thready beat against her fingers. He lay terrifyingly still, the thrashing having ceased. Sylvia feared she was losing him. She knelt by the cot, her own body screaming with fatigue, and watched the faint rise and fall of his chest. The fire crackled. The wind howled. In that moment, the cabin felt like a tomb. She must have drifted off her head, resting on the edge of the cot. She was woken by a touch. Her eyes snapped open, her heart leaping into her throat. The warrior's eyes were open. They were dark, lucid, and fixed on her face. The fire was gone from them, replaced by a bottomless exhaustion. His hand, which had been resting on her hair, fell away weakly to the cot. Neither of them moved. The silence was absolute, broken only by the wind. His gaze was intense, searching. It held no malice, only a deep, profound confusion and a flicker of something else, wariness. He was a wild creature, cornered and wounded, unsure if she was the source of his pain or the reason for its easing. Sylvia slowly straightened up her joints, protesting. She didn't smile. She didn't offer any placating words he wouldn't understand. She simply met his gaze, letting him see the exhaustion in her own eyes. She wanted him to see that she was not a threat, merely a woman who was just as trapped as he was. His eyes flickered to the clean bandage on his side, then to the empty cup on the floor, then back to her. A silent question. Sylvia picked up the cup and gestured to the water bucket. "Water," she said, her voice raspy from disuse. She pointed to him. "You, water." He watched her, his expression unreadable. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. The fever had broken. The warrior was awake. The storm outside showed no signs of abating, the snow piling in great drift against the door and the single window. The immediate crisis of life and death had passed, but as Sylvia brought him a fresh cup of water, their hands brushing as he took it, a new and far more complicated danger settled into the room. They were no longer a nurse and a patient. They were a white woman and a Lakota man, awake, aware, and utterly alone, sealed inside a tinderbox of history and fear, waiting for a spark. The passing of the fever did not bring peace. It brought a heavy, watchful silence, thicker and more suffocating than the snow outside. The warrior, though weak, was possessed of a coiled stillness, an awareness that missed nothing. His eyes followed Sylvia's every move as she stoked the fire-kneaded bread dough or checked the latch on the door. It wasn't the gaze of a grateful man. It was the sharp, calculating watchfulness of a predator assessing a rival. They existed in a fragile, unspoken truce, communicating through the barest of gestures. A nod from him meant he needed water. A tipped chin from her indicated a bowl of broth she'd leave on the floor by his cot. For 2 days they were ghosts in each other's presence, sharing the same small space, but separated by a chasm of language and blood-soaked history. Sylvia learned the rhythm of his breathing, the way he would test his own strength by clenching a fist, or attempting to sit up only to fall back with a quiet hiss of pain. He in turn learned the sounds of her life, the scrape of her knife on the cutting board, the soft thud of her axe, splitting kindling on the porch, the rustle of a page as she read her Bible by lamplight, a ritual that felt more like an anchor than an act of faith. On the 3rd day of his consciousness, the 4th since she'd dragged him from the snow, he spoke. Sylvia was adding broth to a pot of simmering rabbit stew when his voice, low and raspy, cut through the quiet. "Kaga." She turned, startled. He had pushed himself up into a sitting position against the wall, his face pale but resolute. He pointed a finger at his own chest. "Kaga," he repeated. His name. Sylvia's heart gave a little thump. It was the first bridge across the chasm. She wiped her hands on her apron and pointed to herself. "Sylvia!" He tried the name, his tongue stumbling over the foreign sounds. "Elara." It came out rough, but it was an attempt, a fragile peace offering. He then gestured to his bandaged side, his expression hardening. He made a sharp, stabbing motion with his hand and said a word in his own language, a word that sounded like a curse. Then he looked at her, his dark eyes demanding an answer. He wasn't just asking what happened, he was asking if she was responsible. The accusation, unspoken but clear, stung her. She shook her head fiercely. "No," she said, her voice firm. She pointed from him to the door, and then made a motion of falling. "Snow," she said, pointing outside. "I found you, in the snow." He watched her, his gaze unwavering. He didn't seem convinced. To him, all white faces likely looked the same, and the memory of his attack was probably a blur of pain and snow. Frustrated, she tried another way. She took a piece of charcoal from the hearth, and on a clean patch of floorboard drew a crude stick figure of a man lying down. Then she drew a simple cabin and a stick figure of a woman with a triangle for a skirt dragging the man towards it. She pointed to the drawing of the woman, then to herself. Karga watched the primitive art unfold a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He then took the charcoal from her hand. His own fingers, though stiff, were surprisingly deft. Next to her drawing, he sketched something else. He drew a horse, then a man riding it. Then he drew a second man, also on a horse with a rifle. The stick figure with the rifle shot the first man, who fell from his horse. The victorious figure then took the reins of the dead man's horse. He looked up at Sylvia, his meaning chillingly clear. He hadn't fallen. He was ambushed, shot from his horse, and left for dead. But it was his next action that truly froze her blood. The man with the rifle in the drawing Karga added a detail to his face, a thick, bushy beard and a hat with a chunk missing from the brim. Sylvia knew that hat. It belonged to Gideon Croft, a greasy, foul-mouthed trapper who passed through her valley twice a year. He was a man who looked at her with a leering familiarity that made her skin crawl, a man whose presence always felt like a stain on the landscape. He had been by the cabin not 3 weeks ago, his face a mess of coarse beard, wearing that very same battered hat. He had tried to trade her a few mangy beaver pelts for flour and whiskey, and she'd sent him packing. Karga hadn't just been attacked. He'd been attacked by someone she knew. A white man. And Gideon was likely still in the region. The cabin, once a sanctuary, suddenly felt like a trap. The next day, her fears were realized. She was outside chipping ice from the water barrel when she heard the unmistakable sound of snowshoes crunching in the distance. Her head snapped up, her body rigid with alarm. Through the thinning trees, a figure emerged. It was Gideon Croft. "Just my luck," she breathed, her heart pounding. "Just my cursed luck." She darted back inside, her mind racing. "You have to hide," she hissed at Karga, using a frantic combination of gestures, pushing him down, pulling a blanket over him. "Hide now." He understood the urgency in her tone, if not the words. With a grimace of pain, he lay flat on the cot, and she threw the thickest bearskin over him, arranging it to look like a pile of bedding. It was a pathetic deception, but it was all she had. She grabbed her rifle from its pegs, her hands slick with sweat, and stood by the door, trying to compose her features into a mask of weary indifference. Gideon reached the porch, his breath pluming in the cold air. He was a big, slovenly man, his eyes small and reedy in his bearded face. The battered hat was perched on his head. "Afternoon, Widow Thompson," he boomed, his voice overly familiar. "Thought I smelled rabbit stew a mile off. A man gets tired of his own cooking." "Gideon," she said, her voice tight. She kept the rifle held loosely in her hand, the barrel pointing at the floor. It wasn't an overt threat, but it was a clear boundary. "What do you want?" His eyes darted past her, scanning the inside of the cabin. "Just being neighborly. Seeing if you survived the big snow. It's a bad one. Heard tell the Sioux are on the move again, driven down from the north by the army. A woman alone ought to be careful." His gaze lingered on the cot. "You got company?" Just myself, Sylvia said, moving slightly to block his view. And I have enough stew for one. The trading post in Custer is low on flour. It was a lie, but a plausible one. Gideon grinned a brown-toothed affair. Always sharp with that tongue, ain't ya? He shifted his weight. Funny thing, I was tracking a prize buck a few days back over by that ridge. Lost him in the storm. But I found something else. Blood. Lots of it. And tracks. Looked like a man being dragged. He stared directly at her, his eyes glinting with suspicion. You wouldn't know nothing about that, would you, Sylvia? The air in the cabin grew thick and cold. Under the bearskin, Karga was unnaturally still. Sylvia could feel his presence a silent, burning coal of fury and tension. She prayed he wouldn't move, wouldn't even breathe. Her own heart was a drum against her ribs. She forced a cold smile. The only thing I've been dragging is firewood, Gideon. Maybe one of your traps caught something you weren't expecting. He grunted, not satisfied. He took a step toward the door. Mind if I come in and warm my hands? The wind's got a bite today. This was the moment. If she let him in, he would see. He would know. And what Gideon would do to a lone woman, harboring the man he'd tried to kill, was a thought too dark to contemplate. No, she said, her voice dropping, losing all pretense of civility. She raised the rifle just an inch, the gesture subtle but unmistakable. Now is not a good time. For a long second, they stood in a standoff. The trapper, his hand hovering near the pistol on his hip, and the widow, her finger resting near the trigger of her rifle. Gideon's eyes narrowed, weighing his options. Finally, with a dismissive snort, he backed away. Have it your way, he spat. But don't come crying to me when you find a savage's knife at your throat. He turned and shuffled away, his figure slowly disappearing into the trees. Sylvia stood frozen until he was gone, her knuckles white on the stock of the rifle. Only then did she bolt the door, her body trembling. She turned to the cot and pulled back the heavy rug. Karga was looking at her, and for the first time the suspicion in his eyes was gone. It had been replaced by something new, something that looked terrifyingly like respect. He had heard. He had understood. He knew that she had just lied to the man who tried to kill him, putting herself in the direct path of that same danger. The chasm between them was still there, vast and deep. But in that moment, standing together in the shadow of a shared enemy, they had found a small, precarious patch of common ground. And they both knew that Gideon Croft would be back. Gideon Croft's departure didn't bring relief. It left behind a poison in the air, a certainty that the danger had only been postponed. The shared threat, however, changed the atmosphere inside the cabin. The wary distance between Sylvia and Karga collapsed into a tense, functional alliance. They were no longer just a white woman and a Lakota man. They were two people in a cage, and the tiger was circling outside. The next morning, the 5th day since she found him, marked the turning point. Karga was on his feet. He was unsteady, his hand braced against the log wall, but he was standing. His wound still pained him, but the iron will of the warrior was beginning to overpower the weakness of the flesh. He walked the length of the small cabin, testing his legs, his eyes taking in every detail with a new purpose. He was no longer a patient. He was a strategist. He stopped at the single small window. With a gesture, he called Sylvia over. He pointed outside toward the path Gideon had taken, then drew a finger across his own throat. He didn't need words to convey his meaning. This cabin was a death trap. It had one entrance and one tiny viewpoint, an easy place to lay a siege. Sylvia understood. A grim nod was her only reply. For the past 3 years, these walls had been her fortress. Now she saw them as Kaga did a coffin, waiting for the final nail. A new routine began, one of preparation. The unspoken truce of broth and bandages became a silent partnership in defense. Kaga, unable to do heavy work, became the teacher. He took one of Sylvia's kitchen knives and, using a whetstone, began to sharpen it with a patient rhythmic scrape that filled the cabin. When it was sharp enough to shave the hair from his arm, he handed it to her handle first. He then pointed to her rifle. He mimed shooting, then a long pause, then being rushed. He was telling her the gun was good, but slow. The knife was for what came after. He taught her to listen. In the evenings he would hold up a hand demanding absolute silence. He'd close his eyes, his head cocked, and she found herself emulating him, trying to pass the language of the wilderness she had only ever ignored. She began to distinguish the groan of a snow-laden branch from the snap of a twig under a heavy boot, the low moan of the wind from the distant call of a wolf. Sylvia, in turn, was the provider. She kept the fire roaring, the stew pot full. She melted snow for water, but her work took on a new urgency. When she went to her woodpile, she didn't just gather fuel. She scanned the trees, her eyes searching for any sign of movement, for the battered hat of Gideon Croft. She began to think of the terrain around her cabin, not as a backdrop, but as a battlefield. That cluster of rocks could provide cover. That gully could hide an approach. One afternoon, Kaga found Josiah's old bow and arrows. The bowstring was frayed, and the arrows were fletched for a white man's hunt, not for war. He spent hours restringing the bow. With sinew he painstakingly stripped from a dried rabbit hide. He examined the arrows, shaking his head at the clumsy fletching, but he sharpened their iron tips nonetheless. He was arming himself with the ghost of another man's life. As he worked, Sylvia watched him. The hard planes of his face, the focused intensity in his eyes. She saw the warrior, he was the man he was becoming again. And in his presence, she felt a strange and unwelcome feeling. It wasn't fear anymore. It was a kind of security. The silence in the cabin was no longer the echo of her loneliness, but the quiet concentration of two people with a single purpose. She hadn't felt this sense of shared struggle of another person's strength beside her own since Josiah had been healthy. The realization was unsettling. It felt like a betrayal. That evening, as the light began to fail, Kaga stood by the door. He held the newly strung bow in his hand. He looked at Sylvia and gave a single, sharp nod toward the setting sun. Then he pointed to the door and drew a circle in the air with his finger. Tonight. The word hung between them as clear as if it had been spoken aloud. Gideon would use the cover of darkness. He would not wait another day. Sylvia's blood ran cold. She bolted the heavy bar across the door. She moved a small, heavy table in front of the window, leaving just enough space to sight the rifle through. She laid out her ammunition, a small box of cartridges, precious as gold. Kaga took his position on the floor near the hearth, but away from the direct line of the window, his borrowed bow across his lap, the handful of arrows beside him. The fire crackled. The wind soughed around the eaves. They sat in the flickering light, a woman with her dead husband's rifle and a man with his ghost's bow, and they waited for the war to come to them. Night fell like a black shroud. The world outside the cabin disappeared, leaving only the sounds that Kaga had taught Sylvia to hear. The temperature had dropped, and the snow crunched underfoot with a sound like breaking glass. Every groan of the cabin's logs, every skittering mouse in the walls sent a jolt through her. They waited for what felt like an eternity. Karga was a statue carved from shadow, his breathing so slow and even she could barely detect it. Sylvia sat in her rocking chair, the heavy rifle resting across her lap, her thumb stroking the cold steel of the receiver. The fear was a living thing in her gut, a cold, coiling snake. But it was tempered now by a hard, defiant anger. This was her home. No one was going to take it from her. The first sign was a flicker of movement near the tree line, a shadow detaching itself from other shadows. Sylvia's breath hitched. She saw it. Karga, without turning his head, held up a hand. Wait. Two figures emerged from the darkness, moving in a low crouch. One was large and bulky Gideon Croft. The other was shorter, wirier. Sylvia didn't recognize him. Gideon had brought a friend. They separated, circling the cabin like wolves. Gideon headed for the front toward the door, while the other man slunk around toward the back, where there was no window, only a solid wall of logs. A classic pincer move. Amateurs. They didn't know about the gaps between the logs. He's sending his friend to make noise at the back. Sylvia whispered the words, barely a puff of air. To draw our attention. Karga gave a slow nod. He understood. He pointed to the front door, then to himself. He would handle Gideon. The man at the back was her problem. A loud banging suddenly erupted from the rear of the cabin, the sound of a rifle butt hammering against the wood. "Hello in there, widow," a reedy voice called out. "Gideon says you got something that don't belong to you. Says you're harboring a redskin." Sylvia ignored him. Her focus was on the front. Through the narrow gap she'd left, she could see Gideon Croft creeping onto the porch. He was holding a heavy pistol, and in his other hand, a lit torch. The fool. He was going to try and burn them out. The torchlight cast his face in a hellish orange glow, his greedy eyes gleaming. She lifted the rifle, resting the barrel on the table, the iron sights lined up on the center of Gideon's chest. Her heart was a frantic drum, but her hands were steady. She thought of Josiah, of the quiet life they had planned. She thought of the cold, hard years alone. This man, this greedy, violent man, was trying to burn it all to the ground. She let out a slow breath, the way her father had taught her, and squeezed the trigger. The explosion of the rifle was deafening in the small cabin. The recoil slammed the butt of the gun into her shoulder. Outside, Gideon screamed a high, strangled sound of shock and pain. He dropped the torch and his pistol clutching at his shoulder as he staggered backward off the porch and fell into the snow, a dark stain spreading across his coat. The torch lay sputtering on the wooden porch, its flames beginning to lick at the dry boards. "The fire!" Sylvia cried, fumbling to reload. Before she could even chamber another round, Karga was moving. He was a blur of silent motion. He slid the heavy bar from the door, kicked it open, and launched himself outside. He ignored the wounded Gideon, who was now writhing on the ground. His only focus was the fire. He scooped up handfuls of snow, smothering the flames with a practiced efficiency. From the back of the cabin, the other man, Jebediah Stone, a failed prospector with a weak will and a thirst for easy money, heard the shot and his partner's scream. Panicked, he abandoned his post and ran around to the front. He saw Karga silhouetted against the cabin's light, tending to the fire. He saw Gideon on the ground. Raising his rifle, he took aim at Karga's back. Sylvia saw him. She didn't have a clear shot from the window. "Kaga!" she screamed. Her voice was all the warning he needed. Kaga dropped and rolled the prospector's shot, splintering the log wall where his head had been a second before. As he rolled, Kaga drew his bow. In a single fluid motion, he came up on one knee, nocked an arrow, and let it fly. There was a wet, choked cry from the darkness. Jebediah Stone staggered forward a few steps, the arrow buried deep in his thigh. He dropped his rifle and collapsed, clawing at the shaft protruding from his leg. The night fell silent again, save for the pathetic moans of the two wounded men. Kaga retrieved Gideon's pistol and the prospector's rifle. He limped back inside the cabin, his face a grim mask of pain and adrenaline. He handed the pistol to Sylvia. They had won the first battle. But as they barred the door once more, they both knew it wasn't over. They were still trapped. Their enemies were wounded, not dead. And the night was still long. Sylvia looked out the window at the two figures writhing in the snow, their blood a dark stain against the pure, unforgiving white. The scene was a brutal mirror of how she had found Kaga, and she felt a surge of sickness in her stomach. This was the world Gideon had made. This was the price of his greed. The lull in the fighting was more unnerving than the battle itself. Gideon Croft's groans had subsided into a low, steady whimpering. The prospector, Jeb, was silent. Sylvia and Kaga stayed at their posts, listening, the captured pistol feeling cold and heavy in Sylvia's hand. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a deep, bone-aching weariness. They both knew Gideon wouldn't give up. A man like that, cornered and wounded, was at his most dangerous. They waited. The attack, when it came again, was one of pure, desperate spite. There was a scrabbling sound from outside, then the sickening smell of smoke, thicker this time. Gideon, using his good arm, had crawled to the back of the cabin and managed to pile brush against the wall, setting it alight with a flint and steel. The driest logs were at the back, away from the worst of the snow. "He's trying to smoke us out," Sylvia said, her voice strained. There was no way to fight a fire at the back of the cabin. They were trapped. Panic, cold, and absolute seized her. They would be forced out into the open, into the path of a wounded, furious man, with nothing to lose. She looked at Kaga. His face was calm, but his eyes were blazing with an intensity that bordered on feral. He would not be burned alive. He would die fighting. The cabin grew hotter. Smoke began to curl through the gaps in the log walls, making their eyes water. The crackle of the flames was growing louder, a hungry, devouring sound. This is it, Sylvia thought. This is how it ends. And then a new sound cut through the night. It was a sound unlike any she had ever heard, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. It was a high, ululating cry, a sound of pure, primal fury, a war cry. It was answered by another, then another, until the entire valley seemed to echo with it. Through the window she saw them, figures on horseback appearing as if from nowhere at the edge of the trees. They were phantoms in the moonlight, their faces painted for war, their breath pluming in the cold. They held rifles and lances, and at their head was a man who sat on his horse with the stillness of a king, a full eagle feather headdress flowing down his back. There were at least a dozen of them. Lakota. Sylvia's blood turned to ice. It was over. She had survived Gideon, only to fall into the hands of a war party. They would see the dead men outside the smoke, the fight. They would see her, a white woman with one of their own. They would assume the worst. They would kill her for what they believed she had done. Kaga had heard it too. But the look on his face was not fear. It was a fierce, blazing pride. He let out a single sharp cry, an answer. He was telling them he was here. He was alive. Outside, the scene had frozen into a terrifying tableau. Gideon Croft, seeing the riders, had managed to get to his feet, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. He raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. The lead rider, the man with the headdress, ignored him completely. His eyes were fixed on the burning cabin. He barked an order, and 2 of his warriors dismounted, running to the back of the cabin and using their heavy buffalo robes to beat out the flames. The leader's gaze then fell on Sylvia, a tiny figure framed in the smoky window. His eyes were like black flint, hard and unreadable. He saw her, the rifle in her hands, the chaos around her. For a heartbeat, Sylvia was certain her life was over. Then the cabin door creaked open. Kaga stood there, framed in the doorway. He was leaning heavily on the frame for support, his face pale and smoke-stained. But he stood tall. He looked at the leader and spoke, his voice clear and strong. In the Lakota tongue, he spoke for a long time. He pointed to his bandaged side. He pointed to the 2 men groaning in the snow. He pointed to Gideon, his expression one of pure venom. And then he turned and he pointed at Sylvia. She could not understand the words, but she understood the gestures. He was telling the story. All of it. The ambush, the snow, the fever. The standoff with Gideon. The final attack. He was pleading her case before the highest court in this land. When he was finished, a profound silence fell over the valley. The leader, who Sylvia now realized must be a great chief. Perhaps Kaga's own father, looked from his son to Gideon, and finally back to her. He nudged his horse forward until he was just a few feet from the porch, looking down at her. His face was a road map of harsh winds and hard suns, his eyes holding the wisdom of generations. He was judging her, and the fate of everyone in that small clearing rested on his word. Sylvia met his gaze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She did not look away. The chief, whose name was Black Moon, stared at Sylvia for a time that stretched into infinity. She felt her entire life being weighed in that gaze. He saw not just a white woman, but the exhaustion etched around her eyes, the stubborn set of her jaw, the way her knuckles were white on the stock of the rifle she still held. He saw the truth of his son's words reflected in her face. Finally he spoke, not to Sylvia, but to 2 of his warriors. His voice was low and gravelly, a command that carried absolute authority. The 2 warriors dismounted. They walked over to Gideon Croft and the prospector Jeb, who was now blubbering with fear. Without a word, they hauled the 2 men to their feet. They stripped them of their boots and coats, leaving them shivering in the bitter cold. Gideon began to protest, to beg, but a single look from Black Moon silenced him. The warriors tied the men's hands and led them away, 2 pathetic figures stumbling into the darkness. Their fate a thing Sylvia could only imagine and did not want to. Justice in this land was swift, and it was harsh. Black Moon then turned his attention back to Kaga. He dismounted, and the 2 men embraced a quiet, powerful reunion of father and son. There were more words in Lakota questions about his wound, about his strength. Kaga answered, his voice full of a relief so profound it was almost painful to witness. At last the chief looked at Sylvia again. He spoke a single word. Pilamaya. Thank you. He then turned and gestured for his son. It was time to go. Kaga limped over to her. They stood on the porch, the air thick with smoke and unspoken words. The chasm between their worlds, which had briefly been bridged by a shared fight for survival, now seemed impossibly wide once more. "Sylvia," he said, the name still rough on his tongue. He reached out and gently took the rifle from her hands. He looked at it for a moment, this piece of her dead husband's life, and handed it back to her. Then he unfastened a small beaded pouch from his belt. It was beautifully made, adorned with porcupine quills in a geometric pattern. He pressed it into her hand. "For you," he said, one of the few English words he knew. She looked down at the pouch, then back at him. "Kaga," she said, her voice thick with emotion. There was nothing more to say. He held her gaze for a moment longer. In his eyes she saw respect, gratitude, and a hint of a shared memory that would forever bind them. Then he turned, and with the help of his father, mounted a spare horse. He did not look back. Sylvia stood on her porch and watched them go. The war party melted back into the trees as silently as they had appeared, leaving behind only the trampled, blood-stained snow and the lingering smell of smoke. The sun was beginning to rise, painting the eastern sky in shades of pale rose and grey. The silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was not the silence of loneliness, but the quiet of peace, hard-won and precious. She looked down at the pouch in her hand. She was still a widow, alone in a small cabin on the edge of the world. But something had changed. The land no longer felt like an enemy. She had faced the worst of it, the worst of men, and she had survived. She had found a dying warrior in the snow, and in saving him had somehow saved a piece of herself. The frontier was still a dangerous place, but she was no longer just a survivor. She was a woman who knew the true meaning of courage, and she would not be afraid again. Thank you for joining us on this journey back to the unforgiving winter of 1877. The story of Sylvia Thompson and the warrior Kaga is a powerful reminder that the lines we draw between people are often fragile and meaningless in the face of shared humanity. It shows us that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the choice to act in spite of it. If this story moved you, please help us share it by hitting that like button. And for more true tales of defiance, survival, and the untold stories of the American West, make sure you subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. We'd love to hear your thoughts on Sylvia's choice in the comments below. What would you have done? Until next time, stay curious and stay brave.